All right, let's do this. Welcome, everybody. Jordy here with Actual Tech Media. Welcome to our inaugural Gorilla Guide Q&A video. We're going to be discussing the top questions that we get at Actual Tech Media when we run an end user computing or a VDI event. We thought we'd compile all of these and get an expert rustled up and discuss this all together. And so here today I'm with James Green, who's a partner here at Actual Tech Media. James has had lots of time designing and deploying EUC and VDI solutions in the field. So welcome, Jimmy G.
Heyo. I'm excited.
All right, let's do this. So this is, like I said, our first one. We're just going to roll with it. Whatever happens, happens. But we have good expectations for what kind of content this will produce for everybody. So we're going to split the questions into categories that you'll see on the right-hand side there, and bang these off one at a time, and hopefully you find these answers useful as a listener or viewer today. So obviously EUC, VDI, bigger deal than it has been with so many people working at home right now. James, do we still call it VDI? Am I using the right word there?
Yeah, I think so. I think you hear a lot of people talking about end user computing or EUC more often than they say VDI today, but I think really EUC is just kind of a bigger umbrella term, which encompasses VDI, but more. So all of the ways that your people get their job done. And as you mentioned, it's becoming more diverse and more important right now with people being sent home and working from all over the place. Having good ways to enable them to do their job is critically important.
Yeah, for sure. So here's one. We'll kick it off with, what's the point of all this? So if I, as an IT pro or an IT manager, I take this up the chain and my management team says I can access everything I need from my phone. It's all in the cloud. What do we need an EOC or a VDI solution for our remote workforce for? Like, can I just Dropbox? Why?
Because cloud, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, so there's lots of reasons. At the end of the day, even in a small company, it can quickly become challenging to keep under control what lives where, how you get access to your applications and your documents, and how in 2020 and beyond you secure it, which is like, if you think that you're not at risk of somebody trying to steal your data, you've been living under a rock, because you might have been able to make an argument for a while that the hardcore hackers are going after bigger, more high value targets, but like literally everybody is a target today. And so having ways to govern your data, to be sure you're compliant, be sure it's secure, and perhaps more tangibly make it easy for people to get their job done is really important. And so specifically on the subject of VDI, to make that manageable, especially at scale, it's important to have some sort of platform like VDI, because if it's like you said, and Joe in accounting spins up his own Dropbox to send Sally in HR a link, and IT has no awareness of this Dropbox account, that becomes one silo where data is lived and not secured and all that, and you can see how that could quickly spiral out of control. So
yeah,
I guess I'm not mandating VDI for everybody, but to keep things under control, it's a really good approach, I think.
Right. So there are times when it's a good solution, right? The usual sort of classic EUC or VDI type deployment. So what are the advantages? Like custom apps that we've got to run on some server that's 100 years old? Is that typically what causes us to have to do this, or what?
I mean, it's in a lot of cases, things are chained to corporate applications that have been custom developed for this business over time, and users still need to access them. As much as it would be nice if your business was born in the cloud, as Actual Tech Media was, and where Office online and file storage online and everything online, most businesses don't have that luxury. And so, this is one way to get people into those applications and stuff like that. From a management standpoint, imagine trying to, especially now that everybody's sent home, remotely manage 1,000 laptops or maybe it's not even all laptops. Maybe it's hundreds of laptops and hundreds of iPads, and you need to keep all of these things patched. You need to make sure that they're got the latest versions of all of the corporate applications and all this stuff. Compare that to managing, say, 3 or 4 pools of desktops that you can update 1, maybe 2 golden images, and push those updates out to the whole company. It's on a completely different level from a management standpoint. From a security standpoint, same thing applies. You go patch 1 golden image, you've patched 1,000,
Yeah.
as opposed to cranking through 1,000 people's laptops at home. From a continuity perspective, so let's imagine that Jordy's out on a business trip and he parks his car on a street in San Francisco and goes in to have a nice dinner, comes back out and his window's smashed out and somebody stole his laptop.
That doesn't happen.
Right? On the streets of San Francisco.
Yeah, no kidding.
If all of your work and your applications were set up on your laptop, it's gone. It's going to take you 3 weeks to get back up and running at the same speed you were at before your laptop got stolen. If you're working in a VDI environment where things are abstracted well, you literally go up to Best Buy, you buy another one, you install the client application to connect to it, you log in, and you're back doing the same thing you were doing before your laptop was gone, before you even went back to your hotel. So
Right.
That's one
So I
example.
guess that has.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I guess that has implications too for extending the life of the hardware that's already out there in the field, right? So if you've got older laptops and desktops out there, you're faced with this choice. Do I do a desktop or not laptop refresh, or do we try and extend the legs of these things and use them for VDI?
Yeah, it's something we see a fair amount of when a bunch of devices are getting to the end of their life, or, and a lot of times it's these things get combined, and people are pushing for some sort of BYOD program. So they want to, I don't want to have to work on my corporate laptop anymore. I want to be able to work on my iPad. So what ends up happening is I've seen a lot of people turn their aging desktops into more or less thin clients by basically installing a lightweight Linux OS on the desktop that does nothing more than connect up to the VDI connection brokers and grab a virtual desktop instead. And so as an endpoint device, the same PC that's been sitting on their desk for the last 5 years stays there, but they get a fresh desktop that's now running on fresh hardware, and it's maintained all the time, and it's easily supportable. And by the way, it may be better than the one they had on their desk by quite a bit, because we've got newer generations of hardware involved. We may have GPU acceleration accessible to them when it wasn't before, and so you can take this old, basically expired desktop and use it as a gateway to an actually pretty powerful new machine. And of course, it's not like that's free, right? Instead of buying 1,000 laptops, now you're buying the infrastructure to build a VDI environment. So, but the experience, at least in most of the cases I've seen, is better than if I were to just go try and roll out 1,000 new desktops or laptops instead. So yeah, it absolutely can extend. It can A, extend the life of stuff that's aging out, and it can B, it can enable the BYOD policy you've always wished you had.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I think you brought up graphics too, and that's one that comes up again and again on webinars. Like, can I run graphics-intensive applications? I keep hearing everybody talk GPU performance. What doesn't work? Does that work, or is that a bridge too far, or how is that now?
That's a thing. At the early stages of that, it was one of those things that I think a lot of times was more expensive than it was worth trying to tackle. So yes, it could be done, but it was prohibitively expensive. I think what we're seeing now is it's approachable for a lot of people. And so you're seeing computer-aided design companies do VDI, no problem, or better. You're seeing graphics professionals who are working in Adobe Creative Suite, things like that, do it in virtual desktops. And like I said, economically or better. So the reason I say better is because in the old model of computer on desk, if I have to buy a workstation grade machine and stuff it full of graphics processing power on every desk for somebody who's working in those sorts of roles, I can't share those resources at all. Whereas in a VDI environment, let's say that I build out a pool of, 20 desktops. I buy a couple of cards and each user gets 1/4 of each of those cards. So now I'm amortizing the expense of graphics processing capabilities for one user, for 4 users across one card. And so it actually now is not prohibitively expensive. It's actually like it can allow you to do more of that within your budget.
Right. But I mean, there's got to be some limits on that. You're not going to be rendering the Avengers movie on VDI, right? I mean,
no, of course not. But I would say the limitations of that are probably, I haven't personally deployed a whole ton of graphics intensive clusters, but based on what I have seen, I would guess the ceiling is probably higher on doing it this way than the ceiling on rendering in a local machine. Like you'll
Really?
have access, you would be able to access a greater pool of resources horsepower wise than you probably could in your local machine.
Super cool. Very cool. All right. Let's talk user experience for a minute. Hit the dinghy. There we go.
Ding.
All right. User experience. Here's where me as an end user, I bring lots of dumb little questions. So bear with me here. So let's talk devices. I don't want to use my company laptop. I want to use my MacBook. I want to use my iPad. I just got a new trackpad for my iPad and it's like a computer now. Can I just use this?
Yeah. So it's back to what I was saying earlier, when you've got people asking to use their own devices like you're asking me right now. A VDI deployment is the best way that I know of to let them do that. And the reason this is it makes doing that so accessible is whatever the endpoint device that you want to use is really just a way to stream video frames and control from the machine that's back in the data center. So I don't care if you want to use your iPad. I don't care if you want to sit there and do it on your iPhone. Which is totally possible. Or maybe you've got the most fully loaded gaming computer that's capable of more than the virtual desktop that I'm going to give you. Anything on that spectrum is a perfectly good endpoint device for accessing your virtual desktop.
Very cool. So users are not necessarily going to hate you for doing this.
No.
Because it's going to give them more flexibility.
What you just said is probably the number one reason that otherwise perfectly good VDI deployments failed, especially historically. We've, as an industry, gotten a lot better at doing it now, but in the early days, a bad user experience is like the reason that people rejected this and the initiative didn't get expanded. It used to be that it was really hard to provide a good end user experience. Anymore, I don't want to imply that it's trivial, but it's completely doable to provide an experience that's as good or better than the one that they were having. And users will not only push back, but at the end of my full-time VDI consulting career, I started to see a lot of, they're happier now than they were before. They love it.
That's cool.
Like, imagine a troubleshooting scenario where they're stuck and they've taken this thing to the help desk like 3 times and they click around and reboot and it's not getting better. The troubleshooting experience on a virtual desktop might be like, throw it away. We'll give you a new one. And that's all done in the process of 5 minutes. That's not something you could ever do with a laptop. It's like, leave it with us for 3 days. We'll image it. We'll restore it onto another one. I mean, it's terrible.
Yeah.
And so
not everybody's Google where there's just a rack of them. They just like, here, use this.
Yeah, right. We expect those to last 9 months. Forget about it.
Yeah.
So I think I have started to see in recent years that not only are people, end users, satisfied with their VDI experience, they're happier and more productive with it than before it.
Okay. Now here's a big one. As a user, I want to use multiple monitors. I want it to be like Swordfish. I got like all these monitors displayed. No, I'm just kidding. Let's say I just want to use 2.
It's
Well, that's a
actually,
pretty
I don't know
obscure
if you can see
reference,
this,
but
but it's kind of like swordfish in here right now. You see that?
well, that's pretty nerdy. But yeah,
So,
but like yeah, let's talk multiple monitors in a VDI
so
environment.
back to the point about the endpoint device can be just about anything. As an extension of that, whatever your endpoint device can talk to is in most cases also going to be accessible to your desktop. So that could be monitors. So I'm sitting here with a couple monitors in front of me. If I were to connect to a virtual desktop that had the GPU resources to drive these monitors, that would be fine. I could use them. If I were connected to a USB microphone that I wanted to use within that virtual desktop, as long as my administrator allowed that, my endpoint would pass that through. So it really, and again, this is one of those things that has matured over time, but today you really could use just about any peripheral you would use if you're sitting here with your laptop right in front of you in your virtual desktop too. So it's not a limiting experience factor.
Very cool. And so what about printing? So my users, they print all day long, right? So how does that work?
Same thing. So the virtual desktop is going to be able to access the printers that both are accessible to it in its network, which might be printers in your office, say, but then it's also going to be able to, administrator allowing this, access a printer that's hanging off of your endpoint device. So maybe that's in your home network. Really not a problem. The one thing that can get a little bit tricky there is in bigger environments where they're using a print server, you got to think about the round trip of that print job. So it can get a little funky routing print jobs this way and that when your endpoint is outside the network, but the desktop is in and the print server is in, but then the printer is out, and it can get tricky. That said, it's absolutely something you can do. And again, not a limiting factor.
Cool. And I mean, you talked about, using, microphones and sound devices, speakers, all that kind of stuff locally. This is a big thing now, right? Everybody's on 10 Zoom calls a day right now. I mean, how does that work over an EUC environment?
Yep. And yeah, more important than ever, right? So the mature protocols that VDI uses are meant to carry that sort of traffic. So whether that's screen refreshes, so when you're doing your CAD stuff, it's that your spinning of the model, it feels fluid, or whether that's a VoIP call. There are kind of protocols and supporting, how should I say this, main protocols and then supporting protocols that are specifically meant to do that kind of thing. So for instance, there is a sort of real-time communication protocol that will carry your VoIP traffic so that it feels real-time and natural and just as good as if you and I were having it here. And that kind of runs alongside the main protocol that is remoting your screen refreshes and stuff like that. So
cool.
Yet again, not an issue.
So if they want to share their desktop on Zoom or, show people what's on their desktop or in Teams or whatever, when they're on a video call, no problem?
So inside their virtual desktop, no problem at all. Outside their virtual desktop, they would just need to join the call from that machine instead. But yep, no problem.
And so if you've got highly mobile users who are often without connectivity, I guess the answer is that they just might not be a good candidate. You might, want to reconsider putting them on that infrastructure, right?
Nope, not a problem. So
what?
Nope, not a problem. It does put a little bit of a constraint on the endpoint devices that you can use, but VDI brokers offer the ability to check out a desktop and take it with you. So you can basically, before you leave, download your virtual desktop to your endpoint device, take it with you, do your work, and when you come back, you check it back in and it will get whatever updates it missed while you were gone and so on and so forth. But even if, and of course you wouldn't want to do this for an extended amount of time, but even if you were going to be offline on a round the world business trip for 10 days, not a problem.
Wow, you just blew my mind right there.
So what I
All
said
right.
about it there being an extra consideration is you need enough local storage on that endpoint device to download the full
Right.
desktop image. And I
Yeah.
mean, we're talking tens of gigs here, so just about any laptop you go buy at Costco is going to be fine, but
Right.
it rules out some like thin client sort of things.
My WebOS tablet is out of the
Exactly.
question. So
Probably not.
got it. Okay. All right. Hit the dinger. Let's talk
Ding, deployment models.
deployment models. I can get everything under the sun as a service now, as a service, right? So can I get VDI as a service or EOC as a service?
You can. So another one of the terms along with EUC that you'll hear more and more often now is DAS, or Desktop as a Service.
Okay.
And so that's all the way at the as a service end of the spectrum. I'm going like this, all the way at this end. So all the way at this end of the spectrum is I'm going to completely roll my own and build a VDI infrastructure on hardware that I own and manage, and I'm going to take care of the whole thing. In the middle, there are products out there that handle essentially like the control plane for VDI. So they'll say, here's how it's all configured. They'll send down commands and say, here's what you should do. And all of the management at the top layer is offered as a service, but it runs on your infrastructure. So you got fully DIY, partially hosted, but running on infrastructure that you own. And that may be because you already own it and you want to use it, or that may be because you have compliance or governance or data sovereignty requirements. And so you want that to live on your infrastructure. But for whatever reason, you want to run it, but you want somebody else to control it. That's kind of the have your cake and eat it too. And then all the way at the other end, it's completely as a service where I can go to Amazon today and say, I would like a desktop, please. And they will make me one and it's ready to go.
Okay. So let's dive into that. Like Amazon, Azure, what are they doing on this front?
So the ability to just create desktops on demand and have those provisioned and deployed very quickly is phenomenal. I haven't done one in the last couple of iterations, but like when I would go do a greenfield starting from scratch deployment, this is probably a week-long engagement to get all of this stood up if you're rolling your own, with a couple of $250 hour consultants besides. To get a handful of desktops spun up in AWS, it's called Workspaces, takes minutes. The piece that isn't just done for you is obviously getting all of your applications installed on there, getting that connected back to all of the stuff in your data center. So not implying that it's, push button, you now have full production VDI, but it shortcuts a lot of the process. Like something we're starting to see a lot of right now is the hype about Kubernetes is kind of being traded for the utility of Kubernetes. And so there's companies offering basically, it takes you weeks and so much money or, months in a lot of cases to get from zero ground floor to we have enough Kubernetes infrastructure and, systems in place to start using it. It was a 6-month process to get there. There's a lot of companies now saying, let us just do that piece for you so you can just get right down to work. Start building apps or, something useful. This is the same thing with VDI. It's like, it's not like you just sign up and you're ready to go, but let us do the whole build the desktops thing for you. Let us manage refreshing them and all of that. And why don't you just get some work done? So in a lot of cases, I like it. It's like a lot of these things, if you have super snowflake requirements, maybe you can't quite make it fit. But for a lot of companies, I think fully hosted desktop as a service is probably mature enough and ready to go at this point.
And then the bill comes.
Yeah. Just like a lot of those things, it is of course important to take it into consideration the total cost of ownership.
Yeah.
not just what you paid in the bill this month, but what did you not pay in supporting it? What did you not pay in standing it up? What will you not pay to refresh it 3-5 years down the road, because that cost is baked into your monthly bill. So, yeah, I mean, I don't think that the costs are outrageous. I think they're pretty reasonable for what you get, as long as you're looking at the whole picture.
Gotcha. All right, let's talk planning and scaling. Dang. All right, what goes into proper planning? I mean, and this is a huge question, right? But I mean, what are the biggest things that you need to start with thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, we could do a whole show just on this one, right? But so a couple of big things. Obviously, from the very beginning, you need to start with how many users do I need to support? That's going to help you scope the infrastructure that you need. One of the biggest challenges in scaling VDI infrastructure is mapping, okay, I know I need to add 20 users. What does that mean for me infrastructure-wise? What do I need to add to be able to add 20 users? Thankfully, there's lots of tools around today to help with this, and you can basically plug in the numbers and it'll tell you with decent accuracy what it is that you need. But so how many users am I going to need to be supporting? What sort of work are they going to be doing? Because that has a big impact on a couple of major potential bottlenecks, those being storage. Storage is, or historically has been, far and away the most challenging part of VDI. It's not so much anymore. Networking, because if I'm going to be doing, say, really light data entry, the sorts of networking throughput I'm going to need to give me a good experience there are vastly different than if I'm a video editor. I'm going to need very different sorts of networking capacity there. So storage, networking, the endpoint devices that you're going to be looking at. So what sorts of capabilities do your users need as far as peripherals, being offline, online? There is a small but existent processing requirement on that thin client. So like, how much horsepower do I need in the thin client? So I think in all of those things, what I'm trying to say is you have to have a good understanding of the intended outcome and not get pigeonholed into either like VDI for VDI's sake, or into thinking too much about the, say, desktop itself or the infrastructure itself, which for IT people is super easy to do. But if you lose sight of like, what are these people going to be trying to do once we get this deployed, you can kind of paint yourself into a corner.
Gotcha. And so you mentioned like calculating this stuff. Like, is there like a calculator out there that helps me figure out what I'm going to need based on the number of users and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so there's a couple of ways to do this, and you can be anywhere on the spectrum, from like pretty simple to you can spend weeks doing these calculations, and of course the tier 1 integrators out there will charge you tons and tons of money to do these calculations for you, and maybe that's necessary. But I guess I have a couple of thoughts about somewhere to start. There's a pretty well-known tool among VDI veterans that a friend of ours has developed for like probably 12 years now, something like that. It's been around for a long time. We can drop a link to that with this, but VDI calculator, Andre Libovici. So last I knew he was at Datrium, but I think maybe he's moved on. But Andre was like at VMware in the really exciting heyday of VMware, and then at Nutanix, and then at Datrium, and absolutely an authority on VDI. And he built this calculator to suck in just tons of inputs and then give you tons of outputs, and you could adjust it with sliders and all this stuff. Cool. I don't honestly know if he's still updating it, but I did Google it, and it's still online, and you can download it. So, and I see it's in a Docker container, so it must have been updated somewhat recently if he put it in a Docker container. That's definitely where I would start, but just be warned, it takes in a lot of data. So one of the great things about using it is it will force you to think through the things that you might have overlooked otherwise. I used it a lot, and that's why, like, you would not overlook things because you had to go collect that data to put into the calculator.
Yeah, for sure. So once you've got your pilot up and going, and your initial project done, do you just add more of everything and it scales out pretty linearly after that?
The nice thing about VDI is that it tends to scale pretty well or in predictable building blocks, because if you're adding 10 users, people in the marketing department, say, are more or less the same from a workload requirement. Like they're all doing the same sorts of things, so their workload characteristics are relatively predictable. And so, yeah, it becomes fairly easy to say, okay, I need to support 20 more users, so I need to stamp out this much more infrastructure. VDI is one of the best reasons that 5 years ago, hyperconvergence was super exciting, because as you add one hyperconverged node building block, you can scale out by however many users one node supports. And so once you learn, I can fit 30 of my users based on their workload characteristics on a node. Then as soon as somebody comes to you and says, hey, I need to add 50 new people, you say, great, I need to order 2 or 3 nodes. And it's pretty straightforward. So if you're lucky enough to be doing VDI on a hyperconverged infrastructure, then yeah, it's like super easy to scale out linearly. If you're not, of course, you can run into some ceilings, like one that a lot of people wound up hitting is on the storage array. You could hit a controller bottleneck where basically you don't have enough horsepower on the storage, on the controllers on the storage arrays, and there's no way to, I mean, you got to upgrade that. Network can be another one that just like gets congested to the point where the only way is to get bigger, because your network is not built to scale out exactly. So it's definitely easier to scale VDI in a hyperconverged environment. And if I was going to build one today, I should be so lucky as to be able to do it on a hyperconverged infrastructure.
Nice. Good to know. So there's so much riding on this, right? If you've gone to this model, if something goes down, it impacts everybody in the organization so much. How do I ensure availability? I mean, I know that's another whole show on its own, but what are the things I need to be thinking about?
Yeah, we've hit on topics where you could do an entire show just on that one, 2 or 3 times now. Yeah, it's a good point. So if you've got a fleet of 1,000 laptops and one of your laptops gets smashed, no big deal. If you've got all 1,000 desktops running in your data center and some genius with a backhoe digs through your fiber,
Squirrels can happen too.
Squirrel jumps into your local transformer, then you've got 1,000 people who can't work unless you have a good DR plan. So yeah, it's extremely important. And on one hand, it's a little bit hard to do. On the other hand, it's kind of easier to do because of the architecture, and I'll explain what I mean. So on one hand, it needs to, and just like every DR case, there's a full spectrum of exactly how seamless you want this to be, how much downtime you're willing to tolerate, so on and so forth. And it all comes down to how much money are you willing to spend on building this out. But just in general, it's a little bit trickier to build out something like this, because DR for something like this, because if you say have all of Jordy's files living on your laptop, and you need to, Susan's laptop crashes, no problem, you've still got all your files. If my whole data center is down, your files are down with them, and even if I give you a desktop somewhere else, your files are down with it. With the data center that's down, you can't work. So my point is, you need to manage all of your data sources and make sure those are highly available too, where if everybody had their own stuff, it might not be such a big problem. On the other hand, you can imagine that if I'm building, say, a couple of pools of desktops out of 3 golden images, to protect that well is only a matter of making sure that I have copies of those golden images at my DR site and I'm able to spin them up, and that my data is replicated there, and that when I spin up those desktops, it's able to attach to that data. And so in the event of some sort of DR scenario, You basically could say, we're going to fail over DNS, spin up the desktops. It'll take whatever, an hour, 2 hours for them to compose. Desktops are built. The users hit the same URL they're used to hitting. They get a desktop. The desktop can access their files. And from an end user experience, it's as if nothing happened. So it's better than the old way of doing things, or everybody having their own computer when an actual DR event takes place.
All right, so let's talk performance now. Hit the dinger.
Performance.
All right, performance. So how do I know if things are working? Like, do I just have to sit around and wait for people to start complaining, or sit in front of a laptop and try and understand day to day what they're seeing, use it myself? Obviously is a good idea, but there's got to be a better way than that.
So one of the cool things about VDI is because all of those desktops are running on the same infrastructure that you're used to working with, the same tools for monitoring it are at your disposal. So you've got, let's say you're running a Horizon View deployment for desktops and it's running on vSphere. You've got all the vSphere tools that you're used to using, vCenter monitoring section, for example, to diagnose, hey, are these things doing well? So that's the first stop, is like the tools that you've already got. You can, because these are just virtual machines like any other virtual machines, you can monitor them there. The next more granular step down from there is you can watch these things with specific like VDI related metrics. So continuing with the VMware theme, you could run a tool like vRealize Operations, and it's got a view snap-in where you can look at view specific stuff. And so maybe that's like maybe measuring boot times or login times or something like that. And you can look at that on a per desktop level, on a per group of desktops level, which is like a pool of desktops, at a cluster level, all sorts of different arrangements that could be useful. And so that can help you diagnose whether the whole thing is doing as well as you would hope. And then if you get into a troubleshooting scenario, there's tools all the way down at the desktop client agent granularity where, I can, there's utilities out there for analyzing, say, logs for the single PC over IP connection between a client and an agent, and looking at how the connection is doing. So you can get into diagnosing things like, is the problem that's causing this user to experience laggy desktop, is it their machine? Is it the connection between the two? Is it the desktop broker? Is it in the data center? And you can narrow it down all the way at that level. But to summarize that, there's a lot of tools available, both very specific for troubleshooting very specific issues, all the way to tools you're already very familiar with and already own. And you can get a lot of insight just from those.
Awesome. And so you and I were talking earlier about the difference between desktop workloads and the difference between server workloads in terms of how you plan for performance. Do you want to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, one of the things that can get people in trouble, and I think it doesn't as much as it used to, but it can still be an issue, is planning and building infrastructure for desktops that is built on your server farm, server infrastructure knowledge, and is built to handle those kinds of workloads. If you do that, it's not going to go well for you. A perfect example of that is storage. So if you look at the I/O characteristics of a desktop versus a server in a couple of ways, even just at the OS level, but then the sorts of applications they're running as well. The I/O characteristics for a server, just as a rule of thumb, might be something like 80% reads, 20% writes. A desktop might be almost entirely the opposite. 80% writes, 20% reads. And so imagine that you built this brand new VDI environment and it was based on, what you're used to seeing in your environment, and it's architected to do 80% reads, 20% writes. You fire all this stuff up and your desktops start doing 80% writes, the whole thing's going to come to a grinding halt and you've got problems. So the storage piece is just one example, but like as a principle, when you're designing VDI environments, you got to remember that although this runs in the data center, just like everything else you're used to managing, the workload characteristics are a fair bit different, and you have to treat them differently.
That's really good to know. So I think basically what you're saying is you could also just throw some flash at this problem.
That's true. That
Maybe
is a
things
good
would work a little
solution.
better.
And I think I mentioned that like this isn't as big of a problem as it used to be. That's because like a
Mhm.
lot of other things, Flash just kind of absorbs the problem and makes it seem like it's not there. And yeah, I mean, if things aren't going well, don't worry about optimizing your queries. Just throw another couple $100,000 array at it, and there you go.
Problem solved.
Problem
So
solved.
is there such a thing as sort of QoS for important tasks, important users? Obviously not everybody's using the desktop for the same thing. So can you manage that in an intelligent way?
Right. That is one challenge that you run up against when you combine all of these resources into, say, one cluster for VDIs. Like everybody is potentially contending for the same resources, and there may be people in your organization who perform a more time-sensitive function, or it's a more critical function, or it's an executive with a short fuse, and you don't want him to come yell at you because the desktop is slow. Uh, you can handle these things by a couple of different things. You can make reservations at the infrastructure level for those desktops so that, for example, you tell it in a time of contention, this desktop always gets what I've allocated, and the resources that we're looking for have to be stolen from somewhere else. That way you could make sure, the HR person that processes payroll, their machine is always working because I want my payroll to process. So at a compute level, you can make those sorts of reservations. You can also treat traffic differently at a network level. So you can say, I want real-time applications like video chat to be prioritized and things like that. So that factors more into all of the user's experience of does this feel like fluid, and am I as happy using this virtual desktop as I would be using a laptop that's on my desk? But at this maturity, there's a lot of control as far as how you want the experience to go and what's most important to you.
Gotcha. So let's talk about what kind of connections are required on the end user end to make this work. You got everybody in their basement right now, a large part of the country, the world. They may not have the best connections. What do they really need for this to be realistic?
Good news and bad news. The bad news I'll start you with, which is it is an important consideration, and if you don't have enough bandwidth there, it can be a poor experience. That said, the good news, really good news, is that it probably takes less than you might think in terms of how much bandwidth is required to have a good experience. You could have a pretty good experience for a regular sort of office worker use case with like 10, 15 megs down, a couple megs up. Because you got to remember in a VDI scenario, if I've got my, whatever, Chromebook here as my endpoint, and I'm connecting to a desktop in the data center, all of the real work and data probably lives there in the data center or in the cloud somewhere, and that's connected through the data center. All I'm really worried about streaming is the screen refreshes and control, so my keystrokes and my mouse clicks and what have you, and maybe some peripheral stuff. Maybe it's a print job or whatever, but in kind of a standard office worker sort of use case, it really doesn't take that much bandwidth. Further, it can be an even better experience because let's say that I'm a video editor and I live in rural America, and the best I can do is a 7 meg down, 1 meg up connection from my local DSL provider. When I finish editing my videos and I need to get those uploaded to Vimeo, I start the upload and it might take me all night to get that video online. In a VDI scenario, if I'm editing in that desktop, when I'm done and I go to upload to the internet, chances are I'm using the corporate internet connections coming out of the data center. And so if they've got a couple of symmetrical gig links that are, pop out right in the cloud, and I could have that video uploaded in 10 minutes. That's a better experience than I ever could have hoped for from my house. And by using a virtual desktop, I get a way better user experience. So not only is it a very surmountable problem, in a lot of cases, you can provide users a better experience than they have access to on their own.
Gotcha. Well, thanks very much, James. I appreciate this. Has been great to get all of this explanation from somebody who's done this in the field quite a bit.
Sorry for being long.
Thank you for. Hey, no, that's okay. We enjoyed it. We need the context as well. So if you want to hit James up on social media, you can find him at actualtechmedia.com. Just hit the footer and you'll find his links for the internets, Twitter and LinkedIn and so forth. Probably TikTok too. Just kidding. And also, if you're looking for more free IT info, the reason we're doing this as part of the Gorilla Guide umbrella is because we want the guides to really provide actionable answers that you can use for discussion inside your organization and help build an understanding of difficult concepts. So we appreciate that, and you can visit gorilla.guide for more free books on all kinds of things affecting the enterprise. I think we've got Kubernetes on there, we've got end user computing, all kinds of goodies. And if there's a topic that you'd like to see us handle in the future on these Q&A Gorilla Guides, please hit us up on LinkedIn, Twitter, or the website, gorilla.guide or actualtechmedia.com, or drop a note in the comments below, and we would be happy to answer it for you. So thanks for joining me today, James, and stay safe out there.
Thanks, everybody.